Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we are trying something new with Instagram Lives. I want to take about no more than an hour to go over this, but I will be answering questions live. I also want you to know that this stream is being recorded and it will be saved to my YouTube channel about an hour after the stream is done, and then I will upload it to YouTube and I'll put a link on my Instagram. Why am I not just saving it to Instagram? Well, because I'm not streaming with Instagram, and then I can't save the live to Instagram the same way that you could if you were. It's a little bit weird. I wish Instagram would fix that feature. If they ever do, I would reconsider doing this. But I don't know if this is going to be a regular thing. I do know that I'm doing it today, so let's do it. Today we are going to go over January 6th. We're going to go over all of the drama drums that were banged by Democrats and Republicans alike in the House recently. So we're going to also go over the previous impeachment of Donald Trump, the powers and purposes of this committee, and most importantly, in my opinion, whether Trump is potentially criminally liable for anything that we know about happening on January 6th. And then we're also going to go over politics on both sides of the aisle of this, which, yes, there are politics on both sides of the aisle that tend to actually favor Donald Trump being effectively barred from participating in an election. And we'll talk about that. Now, I also want to say that I will be answering questions live. I can see the live stream on this side of me. I've got my notes in front of me, I've got the camera here, and then I've got all the stream stats here. So I will be able to manage the stream fully, and we'll see how this goes. So without further ado, why don't we actually get started? So we want to start by just talking about the build up to January 6th, because we have a lot of talk about incitement that Donald Trump did. If we want to say that Donald Trump incited anything, then we need to talk about what actually he did. So first of all, prior to the November election, we already had Trump alleging that mail-in ballots would cause mass voter fraud. At one point, he even tweeted that we should postpone the election. Now, I will say that was entirely unconstitutional. The only way to change the actual date of the election would be via constitutional amendment. There is nothing in his executive authority that would allow him to circumvent that time, which is set in stone by the Constitution. Now, he did allege that there were changes in voting methods, which would lead to fraud. And while it's true that there were changes in voting methods, for example, all states besides Washington and Oregon had changes to their voting policy for primaries in 2020, we don't have evidence that that actually led to any kind of fraudulent vote or ballot casting. So I want to start off by saying very prominently, it was very obvious that Trump was poised to lose in 2020. Okay, people vote based on what is going on, especially in a deeply divided country. And so people instinctively blame who was in power for what was going on at the time, which was quarantines. And that was extreme. It had never happened in people's lifetimes. And so naturally, they blame the executive authority, and it's a referendum on him. The other thing here is something that probably might have taken place even without COVID, and that was that the public opinion of Trump was already waning. Okay, the reason Trump got elected in the first place was basically a referendum of liberal extremists. I don't think that this is a surprise to anybody. But Trump became the epitome of a dumb person with a trigger-happy Twitter account, leading to some incredibly unfavorable media portrayals. Part of that is due to media bias, but part of that is also just because he's a very hard person to actually defend the rhetoric of. So Trump alleged election tampering before the election had even happened, okay? He pledged to challenge the election if he lost in the Supreme Court. He claimed that the election was going to be rigged against him. He even refused to commit to any kind of peaceful transfer of power in numerous statements. He went as far as to say once, there won't be a transfer, frankly, there will be a continuation. That was a direct quote. Now, directly prior to the election, we had several hundred lawsuits pertaining to the election. These primarily had to do with voting technology. The Supreme Court initially heard several of these and allowed emergency injunctions. And then widespread speculation thought that what we might see was a repeat of Bush v. Gore, and that the election would be decided by the Supreme Court entirely. So then when we came to the election itself, as predicted, Trump lost not by a huge margin, but by a small one, right? The national popular vote placed Trump at about 43.2% and Biden at 50.6%, which are rather slim margins when you win by less than 1% of 50. But of course, everything goes down to the electoral count in that case. Biden beat Trump in 9 swing states. Most news outlets called the election on the night itself. But then directly post-election, Trump's campaign began sending out messages to supporters talking about truckloads of fraudulent ballots being brought in at night. We had messages about deliberate miscountings, messages suggesting that various swing states should be immediately added to the Trump win category and that suits were to follow. Of course, we had the infamous call with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where Trump urged him to find just enough votes to flip the state for him. Speaking of which, people have brought up, could that be a criminal conspiracy, fraud, etc.? The answer is if you prove it, but probably not. Throughout the call, Trump maintained that he thought that he had fairly won Georgia, and he just wanted to find enough votes to correct any errors, which could probably be a reasonable defense. Again, the problem with a criminal case against Trump is that you have to prove anything he does beyond a reasonable doubt. So the burden of proof is just so extraordinarily high, which it's not in the case of like a civil case or in the court of public opinion. In the court of public opinion, you just need to cast enough doubt. So we continue to see this constant inflammatory language about having the election stolen from him, and then we came finally to the month of January. Now, as per the Constitution, on January 6th, Mike Pence was supposed to be counting the electoral votes during a joint session of Congress as the president of the Senate, and then he was going to certify the election. According to the 1878 Electoral Count Act, if at least one senator and one representative raise objections over the certification of electors, presumably in this case because they felt that they had been fraudulently cast, then both chambers must meet separately for 2 or less hours of debate before reconvening under majority vote to accept or reject the objection. Now, Republican House members objected to the results in Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, which is unprecedented. But ultimately, only Arizona and Pennsylvania found any Senate support, which then went to a vote. 147 Republicans, which, by the way, is less than the majority threshold to overturn. So only 147 Republicans objected to the results in those states, which kind of demonstrates what went wrong with Trump's plan. So let's actually talk about Trump's plan, because this is super interesting. And the short answer is he wanted to, without any legal basis, overturn the election through a very convoluted Senate procedure. And the long answer could be a video in and of itself. So this is a nice medium-sized answer, okay? Basically, on the grounds that the Electoral Count Act was probably unconstitutional, which it really isn't, John Eastman, Trump's lawyer, wrote this 2-page memo advocating for the following. So what he said, this was a very interesting memo, by the way. I highly encourage people to read it. He literally said Vice President Pence would, as normal, start by counting the votes, starting with Alabama and proceeding alphabetically, as outlined by the Electoral Count Act. And then when Pence got to Arizona, he was going to announce that multiple slates of electors had been appointed, and so he was going to defer that procedure until the other states had been counted as well. So this is going to be the first deviation from the act that he wanted him to do. He would then skip all of the contested states, announcing that the total number of electors are only 454, 228 for Trump and 222 for Biden, and therefore Trump wins re-election. Except, of course, you need 270 electoral votes to become president, not just a majority. So when someone in the chambers was to inevitably raise an objection, we would go to the procedure outlined in the Constitution, which allows the House to elect the president and the Senate to elect the vice president, with each state only getting 1 vote. It's a weird procedure, but it does exist and it's rarely used. And so then when we broke into separate chambers to debate the election of the new president, at this point entirely disregarding the national popular vote or the electoral vote, some Republican senator must demand normal Senate rules, not Electoral Count Act rules, which would include the filibuster. And given that no party would have a 60-vote cloture majority, we would have a stalemate for the vice presidential nomination. So Eastman basically outlined the super cockamamie procedure, and he said that Pence had to do all of this without asking for permission to make sure that the Democrats would challenge the lawsuit before the Supreme Court, banking that now that they had their conservative majority, they would overturn the Electoral Count Act on constitutional grounds entirely and just certify Trump the winner. It was a very convoluted idea, and it required way too much cooperation among the party, and that's why it was never going to work. Okay, ultimately, only 2 states actually became senatorially contested. Mike Pence refused to falsely certify the election. The Supreme Court refused to grant certiorari to Trump. The constitutional structures proved themselves extraordinarily strong to Trump with the power of checks and balances from literally every branch of the government. But Trump did come awfully close. So then we arrive at what actually happened on the day of January 6th. Now, as planned, at 12 p.m. noon, Trump held his rally where he encouraged his supporters to peacefully protest on the Capitol. He said, quote, "We will never give up. We will never concede." Again, this inflammatory language. He said, quote, "Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you." We also have private accounts of Trump being extremely angry towards his attorney general and towards Mike Pence at this point. At one point saying in a private conversation, Mike Pence deserves to be hanged. Trump had then asked his Secret Service officers to take him to the Capitol, saying he wanted to lead his crowd. And then his Secret Service officers denied him on safety reasons and took him back to the West Wing. So now we arrive at the tactical chronology of the protest. The Capitol Police had set up an outer barrier perimeter surrounding the Capitol, which protesters broke through at about 1 p.m. At 1:05 p.m., Nancy Pelosi called the joint session to order, as per usual. At 1:30 p.m., Mitch McConnell took the floor, saying, quote, "If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever," referring to the states and the voters who had already spoken. At 2 p.m., rioters broke doors and windows into the Capitol, leading to a widespread siege. Secret Service agents then removed Pence from the Senate floor, and both the House and Senate were called into recess at 2:20 p.m. At 2:24 p.m., Trump tweeted, quote, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution." At 2:28 p.m., Trump tweets out encouraging the support of the Capitol Police and urging protests to, quote, "stay peaceful." Protesters broke into the Senate chambers just before 3 p.m. and then into lawmakers' offices, most notably Nancy Pelosi. At 3:11, Ashley Babbitt is shot by Capitol Police while trying to siege the Speaker's lobby, which she later dies of, the only death of January 6th, as far as we know. Trump also tweets around this time asking everyone to remain peaceful, but not taking back any stolen election claims, which did not exactly help the situation. At 3:36 p.m., Trump's press secretary tweeted out that Trump had ordered the National Guard to the Capitol and that all protests should remain peaceful. That's what he was advising. At 4:17 p.m., Trump tweeted a video talking to those in the Capitol, asking them to, quote, "go home and go home in peace." And simultaneously, 2 demonstrations in Arizona and Oregon turned violent. At 6 p.m., D.C.'s mayor ordered a 12-hour curfew on the city from 7 to 8. We had a bunch more tweets and Capitol Police eventually clearing out the Capitol with the help of the National Guard. Pence called the session back to order just after 8 p.m. Mitch McConnell said in a blazing speech on the Senate floor, "The United States Senate will not be intimidated," and, quote, we will not be kept out of this chamber by thugs, mobs, or threats." And then finally, at 3:42 a.m., the votes were counted and the election declared in favor of Joseph R. Biden. So in the direct aftermath of January 6th, we also had a very unique procedure, which was that for the first time in history, a president was impeached twice, I believe. I think it might have actually happened once before. I'm going to have to double check that, but it is rare. I can tell you that much. And so the House of Representatives passed an article of impeachment as against Donald Trump, which the Senate heard. Now, historically, no impeachment of a president has ever successfully ended with Senate removal since it requires a 2/3 majority, but they did try. Chief Justice Roberts presided over the hearing as the Constitution demands. And then Trump wasn't convicted of any impeachable offense. Again, this doesn't mean that he didn't do anything wrong. It just means that he didn't do anything criminal. So according to Article 2, Section 4.2 of the Constitution, quote, the president shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. So as we'll get to, he is not criminally liable for basically anything pertaining to January 6th. Nobody has even made accusations of bribery yet, which left treason, right? And in terms of high crimes or misdemeanors, again, he's not criminally liable for anything. So all you really had was treason to try to get him on. Now, if you want to look at the definition of treason, as defined by Article 3, Section 3.1 of the Constitution, it is, quote, levying war against the United States or giving her enemies aid and comfort. That's a shortened quote, but that is a huge stretch to try to say that Trump did that, because Trump also said openly, don't be violent. He repeatedly said, go home in peace. He openly said, urging protests to stay peaceful. He called the National Guard against the protesters. It would be an uphill battle and probably impossible to prove that he levied war against the United States to the extent that it qualifies as constitutional treason. So again, in terms of the second impeachment, nothing actually happened. So now we get to the House committee. The first question I want to answer is, what powers does the House committee actually have? And the answer is none. The stated purpose of this committee is, quote, to advise on legislation. It is one of the most stupid things that you could ever say is the actual committee's job. Like, it would mean that they're going to, bolster funding to the Capitol Police. That would be just about maybe the max that would actually come out of this committee in terms of tangible legislative result. So that quickly brings us to the real purpose, which is to sway public opinion, okay? People have suggested that it's to lay the foundation for criminal liability for Trump. That's simply not true. That's the DOJ's job, and as we'll get over, the DOJ probably can't with the current fact pattern that we know. But also, the DOJ could already go after Trump, just like they could go after you or they could go after me, right? They arrest me. They have 72 hours to file charges. Once they file charges, I can file for bail, or I can appeal for bail in a court, and then I obtain a lawyer, and then we go through the discovery process. Then we go through the we go through trial where I have the right to remain set. Like, it's a normal criminal trial. You know this process. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I committed those crimes. That would be the typical job. And the DOJ could already do that. Nothing about this House committee is meant to lay the foundation for that. The DOJ can investigate on their own. So none of this is going to lay any foundation for the DOJ, except in the court of public opinion, which we'll get to. The next thing I want to address is, of course, the quote-unquote Watergate testimony. So some stuff has actually come out here in favor of Republicans. So, for example, we have text from Sean Hannity on January 6th saying no more stolen election talk. He's talking to Trump, which, by the way, it flies straight in the face against the notion of painting all Republicans as these anti-democracy rioters and as if we were all Trump supporters on the day of January 6th, which was simply not true. Okay, and then we get to the stuff that we had most recently, which was Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. Now, I've seen countless news anchors talking about how this is Watergate testimony. Our ancestors will know, or not our ancestor, our descendants will know her name because of how brave she was. I just want to point out there is nothing really substantive about anything she has said. It's super dramatic. Like, she talked about Trump throwing his lunch plate against the wall and ketchup was dripping down the wall. That's how angry he was. I get it. It's dramatic. I don't even blame Liz Cheney or whoever brought her on. Because if I was given the case, if I was told your job is to sway public opinion as against Donald Trump, I would totally call Cassidy Hutchinson for this. And it makes sense. It totally paints him in a bad light. That doesn't mean that it paints him in a criminal light, though, because nothing she has said actually tells us much that is new. Now, also, she's been a bit impeached in terms of credibility. I want to just clarify really quick. There are admittedly two definitions of the word impeached here. So the first definition is, of course, the traditional legal definition, which is literally like the House passes an article of impeachment and then the Senate hears the trial with the Chief Justice presiding for the president. That's the literal definition of the word impeach. In legal circles, you'll refer to impeached in terms of credibility as basically, let's say that I'm a criminal prosecution lawyer, and I have a witness who says something that I know to be false. I'm going to show them video camera surveillance, and I'm going to show the jury that counters your testimony. I'm going to show you a bunch of images that counter your testimony. I'm going to bring on a bunch of other witnesses to rebut your testimony. And without even filing any charges, I'm just going to prove to the jury that you are totally not credible as a person. That is what we call impeaching the witness. Now, right now, we have a bunch of witnesses who have come forward willing to say that Trump, for example, didn't lunge at a steering wheel or attempt to strangle his Secret Service officer, as Cassidy Hutchinson said. Now, the next thing I want to cover is Cassidy Hutchinson is basically talking in terms of hearsay, which is totally fine in Congress because federal rules of evidence don't apply in Congress, but they would in criminal court. So when people say this could lead to a seditious conspiracy charge, none of that's true. Because it's all hearsay evidence, none of it would be admissible in court. None of it would withstand cross-examination in a federal court of law. It can in Congress because there are no rules of evidence, but it wouldn't in an actual criminal trial. When Cassidy Hutchinson said, yeah, I heard Mark Meadows tell me that he saw objection, hearsay, and that would get sustained because she wasn't privy to that conversation herself, and that's all hearsay, and it doesn't fall into a hearsay exception. So now let's answer the critical question, right? Is Trump criminally liable? No. Like I said, the DOJ could already go after him, just like they could go after you and me. Most of this testimony is not even admissible. We have hearsay, we have withstanding cross-examination. It's not going to happen. Criminal court requires a couple of things that they're simply unable to prove here. First of all, for any criminal charge, you're going to need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You're not just going to need to cast doubt on something. You're not just going to say it's most likely. It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump had the intent to do something and the mens rea to do something, aka the competency to do something. So he had the mental capacity. Now, I feel like you'll be able to prove mens rea pretty easily. I don't know about intent. And we'll go over this in a second because it depends on the actual charge. There are varying standards here. So for example, treason, as we said, in Article 3, Section 3.1 of the Constitution, quote, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. So as with all criminal acts, you have to prove intent and competency beyond a reasonable doubt, aka mens rea. And then you'll need at least two witnesses to testify to an overt act of Trump that he levied war against the United States and or gave comfort to those doing so. That simply did not happen. It simply did not happen. He never levied war against the United States. You can say he incited a riot. You can say, he charged people up. Whatever. That's being irresponsible. That's being immoral. That is not being criminal. Unfortunately, that probably won't withstand First Amendment scrutiny, as we'll get to. So then the next thing that you have is potential incitement of imminent lawless action. Now, I want to point out that this doesn't have a clear statute to prosecute this under. If you've ever heard the phrase, you can't shout fire in an open theater, that came from Schneck, which was a Supreme Court case in, I believe, 1907. And it was also dicta, which means that it wasn't legally binding jurisprudence. So the most recent jurisprudence that we have on First Amendment scrutiny when it comes to inciting anything is from Brandenburg v. Ohio, Hess v. Indiana, and Stewart v. McCoy, where the Supreme Court established the incitement of imminent lawless action doctrine, which claimed that speech was not protected under the First Amendment if it was to incite imminent lawless action with clear intent. Now, again, there isn't one clear statute for this, but at minimum, to withstand First Amendment scrutiny, you'll need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, one, that Trump had the intent and competency to incite imminent lawless action, such as an insurrection, which, by the way, I want to make a quick note here. When he said, they're not here to hurt me, that wouldn't work because he was talking to his own Secret Service agent, and his lawyers could probably claim that he was just trying to calm his Secret Service agent saying, they're not here to hurt me, so they don't pose me a risk. And again, in a court of public opinion, in civil case, you might be able to use that. In a criminal court, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, so none of that would be admissible. And second, you need to prove that Trump's speech was not just advocating, it was directly instructive, which it simply wasn't. In fact, his speech said numerous times to stay peaceful, so that charge simply couldn't stand up in criminal court. So then we get to the third one, which a lot of people have suggested Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony lays the foundation for. And admittedly, this one is a little bit closer, but it's simply not going to work. And that is seditious conspiracy. Okay, so according to 18 U.S.C. section 2384, quote, if two or more persons conspire to hinder or delay the execution of any law of the United States by force, they shall each be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. That is a shortened quote, by the way. So what would you have to prove for that charge? Okay, as always, you'd have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had intent and competency to do that. But also, you'll need to prove that it was at least two people involved. Trump was one of them. Again, you could do that. And then here's where you couldn't. He attempted to hinder the execution of the Electoral Count Act by force. You couldn't prove that because it wasn't his force. And he didn't have any clear instructive action for others to do it. He wasn't directly conspiring with any of the protesters. The Eastman memo that I was talking about, the memo that his lawyer wrote, pertained to acting as it claimed constitutionally and with the interests of the government. So the problem here is criminal prosecutions are all or nothing. It's unlike the court of public opinion, where that you need to have all the standards met in order to levy a successful conviction. And in this case, you simply can't. So now we get to this stuff that has to do with him tampering with congressional proceedings now. So there has been allegations that he witness tampered, which is a subset of obstruction of justice, which does apply to Congress. And I'm not going to get into the specific statutory language because that statute is actually super long. There is no evidence to suggest that Trump himself actually, with the intent to tamper with any witness, attempted to threaten anyone poised to testify before the House. It just wouldn't stand criminal scrutiny. And then the other obstruction of justice charge was obstruction of congressional and administrative proceedings. So the relevant quote from 18 U.S.C. 1505 is, quote, whoever corruptly or by threats of force or by any threatening letter or communication influences, obstructs, or impedes, or endeavors to influence, obstruct, or impede the due and proper administration of the law under which any pending proceeding is being had before any department or agency of the United States, or the due and proper exercise of the power of inquiry under which any inquiry or investigation is being had by either, I'm not going to read this whole thing, shall be fined or imprisoned, yada, yada, yada. The point is, what would you have to prove that he obstructed congressional and administrative proceedings? Well, one, you'd have to prove intent and competency beyond a reasonable doubt, as always. Then you need to prove that Trump behaved, quote, corruptly, meaning with personal gain in mind. You could probably credibly establish that. I don't know if it would withstand criminal scrutiny, but the next part is by any threatening letter or communication. Stop. He can't. The communications that are alleged have to do with Trump saying, quote, he's counting on them to do the right thing, etc. Is it potentially coercive? Maybe. Criminal under this statute? Unfortunately not. Your dialogue is defense. How will the prosecutor build the case? So I'm going to get there in a second. Actually, I'm right here now. So this is where we acknowledge the fact that prosecuting Donald Trump is an inherently political decision. So Merrick Garland, Biden's DOJ, knows he probably can't, in a fair trial, secure an actual conviction of Donald Trump. We're reading the statutes and we simply know that under this fact pattern, there is not the evidence to build up this case. Again, you can do a bunch against his reputation. You can do a bunch to impeach him in the court of public opinion. There is really nothing you can do in a criminal court because the standard of evidentiary burden is simply so high in a criminal case. For good reason, of course. We don't want people going to jail unfairly, and so the standard has to be high. But in this case, it means that he is essentially protected from liability. But I believe politically this was a terrible move for the Democrats. Because here's the thing. Everyday people aren't lawyers, and they don't realize that there is no basis for a criminal conviction here. So right now they're thinking to themselves, okay, we were promised a conviction. We were promised that this is laying the grounds for a criminal liability of Donald Trump. And now they're going to blame Biden's DOJ for not going after Trump criminally. And then in terms of, well, did it actually help them in the 2024 election? I doubt it, okay? Because the other thing here is public opinion is largely sedentary. I don't think that anybody really has changed their minds because of the hearings. I think that most people were already decided that they either were okay with Donald Trump's actions on January 6th, were neutral to them, or they were against them. But very few people, I think, actually had their opinions swayed by the hearing itself. And so I think that this was politically a very unfavorable move for the Democrats. Now, that said, on the Republican side, Trump being dragged to the mud might be a good thing, okay? Because here's the problem. Nobody dares to oppose Trump in the primaries. And he is the only candidate that Biden might have a chance of beating. Now, the reason that nobody is going to dare to oppose him in the primaries is because Trump is known to be a giant friggin' wrecking ball. And that is he will drag any of his opponents to the mud. He is known to be notoriously aggressive when it comes to rhetoric. And he has damaged entire careers of other politicians. So no one dares to run against him. But dragging him through the mud might be a good thing for the Republican Party because, like I said, he is the only candidate that Biden has a chance of beating. And so if he doesn't secure the Republican nomination, then the Republicans have a very good shot of beating Biden just mercilessly in 2024. So this is why I advocate for Ron DeSantis. He has a far less glittered record the way that Trump has. But in conclusion, what did we have to talk about? Donald Trump, in terms of January 6th, did he act morally? Did he act irresponsibly? Etc. Yes. Yes. I have no doubt that he acted like a terrible president, like an irresponsible president, like a terribly corrupt individual, but it doesn't amount to criminal liability. It simply doesn't meet that standard. That said, might it still be in favor of Republicans, oddly enough, to let Trump just be simply dragged through the mud about this? Yeah, probably. So the idea that on a political level, it might be in our best interest to let Trump just be totally impeached in the court of public opinion and still defend the fact that, legally speaking, he hasn't done enough wrong to qualify under any real statute for a criminal charge. Those can both exist simultaneously. I can fully acknowledge that Trump is terrible for the Republican Party and that his public opinion is waning. But that said, that doesn't mean that there is any legal basis to throw him in jail. So now you know how I feel about this. I'm super glad that I did this live stream because I can just explain so much on a live stream that I can't explain in a short form video. I want to thank you all. Again, this video is going to be saved about shortly afterwards. I'm going to upload it to my YouTube and then I'll put a link on Instagram. I have to go now because we have a Federalist Society forum about Dobbs v. Jackson at 1 and an SB9 meeting at 5. So I've got a bunch today, which I will be posting about. I will be thinking about whether I want to do streams like this in the future. I don't know how I liked it. I want to see how it turns out. And I want to also hear your opinion. So let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.